think it's just after 2:30, so we'll kick off. It's my real pleasure this afternoon to introduce Lewis Bollard, who's going to be talking to us about the lessons learned in farm animal welfare. I'm sure Lewis needs no introduction, but he leads the Open Philanthropy Project strategy for farm animal welfare. So before joining Open Phil, he worked as the policy advisor and international liaison to the CEO at the Humane League of the United States. Prior to that, he was a litigation fellow at the Humane Society and an associate consultant at Bain & Company. He has a BA in social studies from Harvard University and a JD from Yale Law School. So if you'd like to ask Lewis a question, please submit via the Bizzabo app. And please join me in warmly welcoming Lewis to the stage.
Cool. Thank you for coming. As advocates, the question we're trying to answer is how we can do the most good for farm animals. And particularly in a space with such limited evidence, I think one of the most powerful forms of evidence we can look at is what has and hasn't worked recently. So in the last almost 4 years now, we've made over 160 grants, totaling almost $100 million on farm animal welfare. And today I'm going to share a couple of the lessons that we've learned in the process. So I'm going to share a couple of lessons there. First, around corporate reforms, what we've learned about securing them and implementing them. Secondly, about plant-based meat and the potential of the sector, the obstacles it faces. And then thirdly, about where money goes in the movement and also where the animals are that need helping. So the first lesson is around corporate campaigns. And the key takeaway here is that implementation is just as important, if not more so, than securing the initial pledges. But I'm going to go into a little bit of detail around that. And first, just to kind of give you some background to how we reached the point we're at today and where we are today. So the corporate campaigns went far faster than we expected. Back in late 2014, advocates started campaigning on cage-free reforms, seeking to get companies to commit to transitioning away from battery cages in their supply chain by specific dates. What you can see here is a photo of some particularly cool activists from the Humane League. And this was kind of a common tactic of really presenting a company and its customers with the very stark choice of facing an aggressive ongoing campaign or making a commitment. This slide sort of tells the story of how these campaigns went. So what you see in the blue line is the progress on US cage-free. That's the number of millions of hens who will be cage-free once these pledges are implemented. And in red, you see progress of international cage-free campaigns. And so what you see is prior to 2014, very few companies had made these pledges, only companies like Whole Foods. In 2015, as these campaigns stepped up, first the major food service companies, led by Sodexo, made these commitments. McDonald's then set off a flurry of activity amongst fast food companies in doing this. And then Costco was the first major conventional retailer to come through. You then saw a kind of cascade effect across all the other retailers, including ultimately Walmart, the biggest. Globally, we've seen a similar phenomenon since these campaigns went global in 2016. Seen partial or complete global cage-free commitments coming from retailers like Tesco and Carrefour, food manufacturers like Nestle, Starbucks, and hospitality companies like Hilton. And initially, I think we thought the lesson was just that this had been really easy and it was kind of case closed. So as of 2016, the egg industry kind of conceded defeat. They said, we realize the future's cage-free. Cages have no further role. We're going to get rid of our cages. It's going to take some time. It's going to cost $7 to $10 billion for them. But you saw all the major egg producers basically making public commitments that they were starting to build out cage-free. They recognized there was no future for cages. In the last couple of years, though, that started to change. So we started seeing headlines like this one from the American Farm Bureau, where egg producers were saying, well, we're actually not seeing any of these companies buying cage-free eggs. So we're scaling back our cage-free transitions. We're not going to necessarily make them through. We saw a survey recently from the egg industry saying they don't think most hens will be cage-free by 2025. And so this is what's really produced the question of how do we ensure implementation of these pledges? So this is just kind of the state of where we're at currently. This graph shows million hens who are currently cage-free in the United States. That's the black line. And then the red line is the number who need to be cage-free for these pledges to be fulfilled completely on time. And what you can see here is we've had pretty substantial progress. So today, as of last month, about 67 million hens cage-free in the United States. That's more than 4 times as many hens as were cage-free before these campaigns started in 2014. Substantial progress. But we still need to get to more than 250 million hens being cage-free. And that requires a quickening of the pace. So what can we do to ensure that this pace of conversion picks up to see that companies actually follow through on these pledges? The first thing we can do is legislation. So most of you are probably aware, last year, California passed a landmark ballot initiative banning not just cages in the state, but also the sale of eggs from caged hens as of 2022. And this is important not just for the direct impacts, potentially up to 40 million hens could be directly impacted, but also for the effect it has on corporate supply chains. Most national corporates operate in California, and so for at least that portion of their supply chain, they're going to have to start implementing on a sooner timeline. And that's something we think is critical, is getting companies to start implementing earlier, so they're not all waiting until 2025 to go 100% cage-free. The second thing we need is public reporting of progress. So this came out 2 months ago. McDonald's said they're a third of the way toward being cage-free. About 2 million hens are currently cage-free in the McDonald's supply chain, and that puts them perfectly on track to fulfill their pledge on time. Unfortunately, many companies are not yet publicly reporting their progress. They're not yet saying whether they've made any progress at all. And so this is something that advocates are going to need to put increasing pressure on, is getting companies to transparently report to their shareholders, to their customers, where they're at in fulfilling these public pledges. And the third thing we need is to get partial implementation progress. And so I mainly created this slide because I wanted to create a bubble chart. But what you can see on the left, the higher a company is, the more cage-free they are. So the further they've progressed on that. You can see on the bottom, on the x-axis, is how big a company they are, basically, how much of the market they have. And the size of the bubble represents how many hens are cage-free as a result of their progress to date. So we can see as well, McDonald's is impressive, 2 million hens. It's really dwarfed by the power of some of these retailers to affect major change. And in particular, I would point you to Costco, which is now at 89% cage-free. My estimate is that's about 8.3 million hens cage-free just in Costco's supply chain. Walmart, which is only 15% cage-free, just because of its massive size, already accounts for about 6 million hens cage-free. So just between those two retailers, that's about a quarter of the hens that are cage-free in the US today, just due to 2 retailers. And so that really shows the importance, focusing on the biggest players in the room, focusing on the huge grocery chains that control the majority of where eggs go in America. So just recap the lessons there. I think one thing we're going to need to see more of a focus on is legislation to ensure that corporate pledges are enshrined into law. The second thing is going to be pushing companies to publicly report. And the third thing is seeking these milestones, saying it's not enough to just publicly report you're at 0%. You need to say we're going to get to 25% by this date. We're going to make particular progress on a timeline. The second lesson I want to share today is around the growth of plant-based meat and the remaining challenges to the industry. So the main update here is that we've been really surprised at how quickly this field has grown. And so I think if you'd asked me what was going to be the most successful IPO in 2019, would definitely not have guessed it would be Beyond Meat. We're seeing a huge excitement around that. Seeing last night we were able to have Impossible Whoppers, also something I would not have predicted a couple of years ago. So we've seen a huge amount of growth. And to give you a sense of what that's coming off the back of, this chart shows meat alternatives as a category in terms of sales. And probably quite surprising to many of you will be that up until mid-2017, it was a stagnant category. So this was somewhere where we weren't seeing substantial sales growth. These products were kind of relegated to a particular section of the supermarket. You had brands like Morningstar, been around a long time, weren't increasing their sales substantially. And it's only in the last 2 years that we've seen a major change in this trend. And I think that's thanks to many factors, but particularly Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods coming out with new, more appealing products, and in particular doing a much better job of marketing those products and setting a much higher benchmark for other plant-based companies to meet. The challenge, however, is on the pricing. So what I've put together here is retail prices, average retail prices where possible, of each of these items in the United States. It's dollars per pound. And what you can see is that the products in red are the animal-based products, the products in green are the plant-based products. we're still quite a long way away from price competitiveness. So Morningstar Farms' chicken nuggets were the cheapest item I could find. This is buying them in bulk from like a Walmart somewhere in Central California. And even there, they're only slightly cheaper than bacon or steak, and still about 3 times the price of the average national composite of chicken prices. So although we've made a lot of progress, and although this sector is growing, we're still a long way away from being price competitive. And so in this chart, I've sought to break down what's holding us back from being price competitive. So I've taken here the cheapest plant-based meat I could find on the market, Morningstar chicken nuggets, and compared that to the average price of chicken nationally in the United States, and this is as of like last week. And what's really kind of astounding here is just how insanely cheap chicken is. So you see the USDA actually provides not just the overall retail price, but breaks it down on the wholesale side too. So you can see that producers are producing chicken for less than $1 per pound. And when you break down what the costs are there, it's almost entirely feed. So 30% of that is everything else except for feed. It's the labor, it's the barns, it's the chicks they have to buy. Almost nothing in the scheme of this price. And then the feed they're getting is incredibly cheap feed. And they're converting it, in the case of chickens, at about a 3x ratio from feed to usable meat. So contrary to kind of what many of us might think, that animal agriculture is inherently inefficient, this particular part of animal agriculture is pretty efficient. And I think something we often lose sight of with plant-based meat is it's one thing to compete with burgers, it's one thing to compete with red meat, it's a whole other thing to compete with this efficiency of the broiler chicken machine. So a couple of lessons to take away from what we see in plant-based meats today. I think one is that the product actually matters. So seeing the growth that Beyond Meat and Impossible Meat have brought to the market, whether that's taste or whether that's marketing. Second, chicken's going to be way harder than beef. So it's one thing to compete with beef, it's a totally different ballgame to compete with chicken, which is, of course, where the vast majority of animals are in the supply chain. And then the third thing is that the basic math of competing with chicken is we need to be able to convert feed into plant-based protein more efficiently than a broiler chicken does. A broiler chicken does it at about 3x into usable meat. And so we need to beat that ratio to be price competitive with chicken. The final lesson I want to share today is just around where money goes in the farm animal movement. So we've pulled together some new analysis, both of where the money goes, but also where the animals are, things we didn't really until recently have any good data on. So this chart shows my best estimate of where money goes in the farm animal movement currently. Now, these numbers might be a little bigger than what you've kind of seen previously. This is a pretty liberal interpretation of farm animal advocacy. I'm including the budgets of groups like PETA, at least insofar as they're directed toward farm animal advocacy or veganism. So a lot of large organizations that you might not think of as the EA animal movement, but nonetheless are working on farm animals. So what you see here is that there's been a huge growth in the amount of money since just a couple of years ago would have been maybe a third of this amount of money involved. So a lot more money in the movement, but still overwhelmingly being directed toward the United States and Western Europe. By contrast, this is our current analysis of how many land farm animals are alive at any point in time. And this is based on a new analysis by my colleague Persis Iskander, who went into all the underlying data from the FAO. And we think we have a better handle here than the FAO does on how many farm animals there are. So our best estimate is about 25 billion globally, alive at any point in time, land farm animals. Again, what you see is about 5.5 billion of those are in America and Western Europe. All of the rest are elsewhere, and predominantly in Asia. And then this shows where the farmed fish are. So this is also an analysis from Persis based on pulling together tonnage, and this is something we'll be sharing publicly soon. And the good news is we actually think there are a few fewer farmed fish alive at any point in time than we thought previously. We think there are about 55 billion farmed fish alive at any point in time now. But again, you see this huge imbalance between where the money is being spent and where the animals are. About 3 billion of those animals in the US and Western Europe, where the vast bulk of money is being spent. The vast majority in China, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So what can we take away from this? Well, I think the first thing is that money's growing in the movement, which is great. We're seeing a lot more money coming in. It's critical, still a lot less than we see in a lot of other movements, combating problems on a similar scale, but still an impressive scale of resources. Secondly, it's useful to know that there are about 25 billion land farm animals and about 55 billion farm fish. And third, that we should focus on Asia, and that we need to get more resources going into Asia. I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lewis. Lots of food for thought. Sorry. Yeah, so a few questions that I had initially. So it seems like, yeah, we thought the campaigns were a great success, and actually it was a bit more complicated than that. On that point, the ballot in California seemed to have made a big difference. Has that made you think about pushing more funding towards getting things on the ballot?
Yeah, so we're certainly thinking about potential ballot measures, and I know a lot of advocacy groups are thinking about that. There are constraints on the ballot measure as a form of advocacy. So only 24 states allow ballot measures in the relevant form that we want, where they can be initiated by citizens. And of those states, many are huge ag states where we don't face much of a prospect of winning. So there are definitely more states where we could still win ballot measures. Ballot measures are expensive, and so there's always a question of whether it's worth bringing those or whether things could be achieved by other means. But it's definitely on the table.
Great, and then, I mean, you kind of addressed that in your last slide about focus outside of the US and Western Europe. What is the state of campaigns and awareness and advocacy outside of US and Western Europe?
Yeah, I think we're at a much better point than we were a few years ago on this score. We're seeing a lot of exciting advocacy going on, for instance, in China and India. In India right now, there's a national moratorium on battery cages, new battery cages being installed, thanks to advocacy there of animal advocates in the courts. It'll probably be undone by the government, but it's still a sign of, I think, the strength of the movement there. And I think we're seeing that too across Southeast Asia. There are a lot of groups we're now seeing that were one volunteer as of a few years ago. Now maybe are 1 or 2 staff members. And I think that's a really exciting trend for people who want to support groups or want to get involved with them to see if we can build up that movement further.
Yeah. And then kind of switching to the meat alternatives, in terms of that price comparison and efficiency, I guess one question was, what is the 3x? Is that like difference in calories?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So the 3x is just by weight of grain to weight of meat. Depends how you define it. Calories, protein, each produce a slightly different ratio, but it's still on the same kind of ballpark.
Okay, and I mean, yeah, and that seems like a very difficult kind of threshold to overcome. Do you have any broad sense of timelines of when that might become price competitive?
I don't know. I think you'd be better asking someone in plant-based meat.
Yeah.
I think that there's obviously a ton of innovation going on there, and also a ton of private sector money going into the space. And I think the one thing I'd say is the importance of directing that at particularly price competitiveness, not just at the kind of big brands. And so companies like Rebellious Foods, who are focusing on making chicken or chicken alternatives substantially cheaper, I think is one of the most exciting things going on in the space.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then some questions from our audience. So how much room is there for getting more of our supporters to organise around new initiatives?
I think there's hopefully a lot of room for that. I mean, I think, at least amongst EA, animal advocates, I think there's a really exciting desire to kind of do new things and to work out what the most effective way to do things is. And I think we see that across the animal movement in general. The movement has changed tremendously from where it was 5 years ago. Even the focus on corporate campaigns, the focus on international work. So I think there's a lot of excitement about doing new things.
Yeah. And then I'm not sure if this is the question, I'm not sure if the statement within it is true, but since fish account for circa 99% of the animals killed for food, how much time and resource should we direct towards fish advocacy?
Yeah, so the statement is true in the sense that if you include wild caught fish, and if you just look at vertebrates, then farmed fish do account for about 99% or more of animals killed for food. I think we should have a lot more focus on fish than we do currently. Obviously, it's a harder thing to motivate people on. It's a harder thing to mobilize supporters on. But I also think ultimately a huge portion of our success is going to be governed by whether we make progress on fish or not.
Okay, great. And in terms of that kind of change in focus, how much collaboration and discussion is there within the movement? And do you think we need more collaboration? I mean, unlikely that we need less, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think collaboration is always good where possible. I think that groups do work well together, and I don't think we want to impose on everyone that they need to all be doing the same thing. I think there's actually a lot of value to diversity of approaches in the movement. So in that sense, I think there can be value to less collaboration.
Okay.
I think it's good, certainly within the EA portion of the animal movement. I think people work together very well, and hopefully that's a trend we can continue.
And then, so what grants have Open Phil made in terms of that community organizations and clean meat?
So on the clean meat side, we haven't made any grants, but we have been funding a chemical engineering consultant contractor who's been looking into the question and is going to hopefully publish a paper on this later this year, and that will kind of inform our funding going forward. On the movement building, community building side, most of the work we've been doing there has been outside of the US and Western Europe, trying to help build the movement in other countries. So things like the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations, which combines over 100 grassroots groups, and we've been funding them to hold workshops to help do movement building in India.
Okay, great. And you mentioned rebellious foods. So one question saying that they've heard Rebellious Foods, formerly Seattle Food Tech, invested in new industrial equipment for extracting protein from plants. Are there other ways to try to reduce the cost of chicken alternatives? I'm not sure how in the weeds you are with that. But.
Yeah, so I think I'm not technically up to date on the ways we could reduce the price of plant-based chicken. But I do think that just having a greater focus on that end of the market, I think understandably, a lot of the companies that conventional investors are most excited about are companies aiming for the top end of the market because there's a bigger profit margin there. And so I think somewhere where EAs or people who want to be impact investors can maybe have some impact is in focusing on the bottom end of the market and trying to compete much more on price than we are currently.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then why did you choose cage-free campaigns and plant-based meats as topic for this talk versus other interventions? Are they the kind of things that you've been spending most time on?
No, actually, I had a list of about like 15 lessons learned, and you get to meet with a speaker coach before this, and she told me that it was awful and I needed to just focus on 3 things. Yeah.
Great. And you sort of mentioned Persis in your talk.
Yep.
How much are you kind of growing the team at Open Phil, or are you kind of, where are you at with that now?
Yeah, so Persis joined us in the last year. She's here, if you want to say hi to her. She deserves a round of applause. So we now have a team of 3 on farm animal welfare, and I doubt we're going to expand it much beyond that in the foreseeable future. But one thing I am really excited about is there are a lot more EA animal research organizations coming up, so Rethink Priorities would be an example. And I think a lot of that kind of capacity in answering questions also helps us do our job well.
Yeah. Great. Let me just see if there's any more that have come through. So it seems like a lot of people you're speaking to are American. How do Americans address animal suffering in Asia without having the kind of potential cultural conflicts that you might expect?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. I think there are a lot of people who want to do things to help in Asia, but are American, maybe don't have a ton of context in the region. And so I think one of the things we can do is just try and direct more funding toward advocates who are in those countries. Another thing I think is a number of international organizations, as they've expanded, have recruited in those countries. So oftentimes the international organization can bring the framework, the administrative side, perhaps experience of what worked in one part of the world, and then can hire locally to bring people there who can sort of do things better.
Okay, great. That's fantastic. Please join me in thanking Lewis for his time today.
Cool. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.